3 months after my husband Harold Powell was buried, I walked into our company conference room and discovered my own children were preparing to sell the business we had spent 42 years building together. My daughter Diane avoided my eyes. My son Kevin kept shuffling papers across the table. My brother-in-law Victor was smiling far too much for a man attending what should have been a family discussion. Then my phone rang. A woman I had never met said 5 words that changed everything. "Don't sign anything today, Bernice." I froze. Before I could respond, she added, "My name is Susan Carter, and I was Harold Powell's real business partner." In that moment, I realized my husband's death wasn't the only secret waiting to be uncovered. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And before we continue, please like and subscribe if stories about family truth and second chances speak to you. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Bernice Powell, and until 3 months ago, I believed I knew everything about my husband. After 42 years of marriage, you think there are no mysteries left. You think you've heard every story. You think you've seen every side of a person. I certainly did. Harold Powell wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend, my business partner in spirit, and the father of our 2 children. Together, we built a life that most people would describe as ordinary. But to us, it was extraordinary. When we were first married, we had almost nothing. Harold worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant outside Columbus, Ohio. I worked part-time at a local bank while raising our children. We counted every dollar. There were months when we worried about keeping the lights on. But Harold had a dream. He believed there was a growing need for industrial supplies and equipment among local factories. He wanted to create a company that would serve small manufacturers the way larger corporations never could. I remember laughing when he first told me, "Harold, we barely have enough money to replace our washing machine." He smiled. "That's why we have to try." And try we did. The first office was a converted garage behind our house. The first inventory filled only a few shelves. The first delivery truck was a rusted pickup that stalled every other week. Yet somehow, year after year, the business grew. Powell Industrial Supply became respected throughout central Ohio. Customers trusted Harold. Employees stayed for decades. And little by little, the company became our legacy. Even after our children grew up and moved into their own careers, Harold never lost his passion. At 68, he still woke before sunrise. He still walked through the warehouse. He still knew employees by name. Sometimes I would tease him. "You know you're supposed to be slowing down." He'd laugh. "I'll slow down when they put me in the ground." Those words haunt me now, because that's exactly what happened. 3 months earlier, Harold suffered a sudden heart attack. There had been no warning, no long illness, no final conversation. One moment he was discussing a supplier contract over breakfast. The next moment he was gone. People talk about grief as if it's sadness. It's much more than that. Grief is confusion. Grief is silence. Grief is reaching across the bed in the middle of the night and finding emptiness. For weeks after the funeral, I felt as though I were walking through water. Everything moved slowly. Everything hurt. I struggled to focus on anything. And during that vulnerable period, my family stepped in. At first, I was grateful. My daughter Diane offered to help organize paperwork. My son Kevin volunteered to oversee company matters temporarily. My brother-in-law Victor began visiting several times each week. Everyone seemed concerned about me. Everyone seemed determined to make life easier. Looking back now, I realize how carefully it all began. Small things at first. Diane started collecting documents from Harold's office. She said she wanted to organize them. Kevin began attending meetings with managers. He said someone needed to keep operations moving. Victor offered advice about finances. He claimed he was only trying to help protect Harold's legacy. At the time, I appreciated their support. I wasn't thinking clearly enough to question anything. But little changes started appearing. Subtle changes. Uncomfortable changes. One afternoon, I visited Harold's office inside the company headquarters. The room looked different. His desk had been cleaned. Several framed photographs were gone. Some filing cabinets were locked. I asked Diane about it. She smiled. "We're just organizing things, Mom." The answer sounded reasonable. Still, something felt wrong. A few days later, I requested a financial report. Kevin immediately volunteered to review it for me. "You don't need to stress yourself out right now." That response bothered me. Not because it was rude, because it felt dismissive, as if my opinion no longer mattered, as if I had become a guest in my own life. Weeks passed. The pattern continued. Whenever I asked questions, someone answered for me. Whenever I wanted information, someone offered a summary instead of documents. Whenever I expressed concern, I was reminded that I needed rest. One evening, I overheard Diane and Kevin talking quietly in my kitchen. They stopped when I entered. The silence was immediate, awkward, suspicious. I remember standing there with a cup of tea in my hand. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Diane forced a smile. "We were just talking about the company." I nodded, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. The strangest part was Victor. Before Harold died, Victor rarely visited. The brothers had never been particularly close. They were polite, respectful, but not close. Now Victor seemed to be everywhere. At family dinners, at company meetings, at my house. Sometimes he acted as though he were already part of the company's leadership. The employees noticed too. One longtime manager, Michael Turner, seemed unusually uncomfortable whenever Victor was around. More than once I caught Michael starting to say something before changing his mind. At the time, I assumed it was stress. Now I know better. One rainy afternoon about 2 months after Harold's death, I found myself sitting alone in our living room. I was sorting through old photographs, pictures from vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary moments that suddenly felt priceless. That's when I discovered a memory that wouldn't leave me alone. About 6 months before his death, Harold and I had been sitting on our back porch. The sun was setting. We were talking about retirement. Completely ordinary conversation. Then Harold became unusually serious. He stared out across the yard for several seconds before speaking. "Bernice." I looked at him. "If anything ever happens to me, don't trust everyone." I laughed. "What does that mean?" He didn't laugh back. Instead, he shrugged. "Just promise me you'll ask questions." At the time, I thought he was talking about business negotiations, maybe dishonest vendors, maybe legal matters. I never imagined he could have been talking about our own family. The memory stayed with me that evening. For the first time, I began wondering whether Harold had been worried about something, whether he'd seen something I hadn't, whether he'd known a storm was coming, and if he had, why hadn't he told me? 3 days later, I would receive a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband, my children, and the company we had spent a lifetime building together. 3 days after that memory returned to me, the pressure began. Not subtle pressure, not gentle suggestions. Pressure. It started with a family meeting that Diane insisted we have at my house. "It's important, Mom," she said over the phone. We all need to be on the same page. By then, I had learned that phrase usually meant someone else had already made a decision. When Diane, Kevin, and Victor arrived, they carried folders and laptops instead of food or flowers. That alone told me everything. This wasn't a family visit. It was a business meeting, and somehow I had become the last person invited. We sat around my dining room table. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Kevin cleared his throat. Mom, we've been reviewing the company's financial outlook. I noticed he didn't hand me any documents, just a summary page. 1 page. 42 years of work reduced to a single sheet. Diane leaned forward. We think it's time to consider selling Powell Industrial Supply. The words hit me like cold water. Selling it? Kevin nodded. It may be the smartest option. I stared at both of them. What are you talking about? Victor immediately joined the conversation. The market is changing, Bernice. I hated the way he said my name. Not like family, like a salesman. The business isn't what it used to be. I looked at him. Harold never said that. Victor shrugged. Harold isn't here anymore. The room fell silent. Even Diane looked uncomfortable. I felt a flash of anger. Not because of the business, because of the disrespect. Harold had been dead less than 3 months, and already they were talking as if his life's work were nothing more than a piece of property. Kevin pushed the summary toward me. We've done the research. I scanned the page. Revenue numbers, expense projections, industry forecasts. Everything painted a gloomy picture. According to this report, the company was struggling. According to this report, selling now would be wise. But something bothered me immediately. The numbers felt incomplete. There were no supporting documents, no detailed statements, no customer contracts, no inventory reports, nothing. Just conclusions. I looked up. Where are the full records? Kevin exchanged a glance with Diane. We simplified everything. I didn't ask for simplified. Neither answered. Victor stepped in. You don't need to worry about the details. That sentence stayed with me. You don't need to worry. I had heard it dozens of times since Harold died. Every time I heard it, I felt smaller, more invisible, as if grief had somehow erased my intelligence, as if becoming a widow had transformed me into a child. For years, I had reviewed company accounts with Harold. For years, I had helped make decisions. Now, suddenly, everyone acted as though I couldn't understand basic financial reports. The meeting continued. The pressure intensified. Diane talked about retirement communities. Kevin talked about reducing stress. Victor talked about maximizing value. Not one person talked about preserving Harold's legacy. Not one person mentioned employees. Not one person mentioned the customers who had trusted us for decades. Money. That was all they discussed. Money. Eventually, I ended the conversation. I need time to think. Victor frowned. There's really not much to think about. I stood. There is for me. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but the pressure didn't stop. If anything, it became worse. Over the next 2 weeks, every conversation somehow returned to selling the company. Every phone call, every family dinner, every visit. The message remained the same. Sell now. Sell quickly. Sell before it's too late. The urgency itself began to concern me. Why were they in such a hurry? One afternoon, I decided to visit company headquarters without telling anyone. The building looked exactly as it always had. Employees greeted me warmly. Nothing seemed different. Nothing seemed desperate. In fact, business appeared healthy. Forklifts moved inventory. Orders were being processed. Phones were ringing. It didn't look like a company on the verge of collapse. It looked like a company doing business. That inconsistency troubled me. While walking through the warehouse, I encountered Michael Turner. Michael had worked alongside Harold for nearly 25 years. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. His face brightened when he saw me. "Mrs. Powell." "Michael." For a moment we chatted about ordinary things. Then I asked a simple question. "How's business?" Something changed in his expression. A hesitation. A caution. "We're doing okay." Okay. Not failing. Not collapsing. Okay. I studied him carefully. "Michael is there? Something you're not telling me." He glanced around, making sure nobody was nearby. Then he lowered his voice. "You should be reviewing everything yourself." The statement surprised me. "What do you mean?" His eyes shifted toward the executive offices. "I think you should look at everything personally." Before I could ask another question, he stepped back. "I've got a shipment arriving." Then he walked away. I stood there for several seconds, confused, concerned, and increasingly suspicious. That evening I drove home thinking about Michael's warning. The next morning I visited Harold's office. For years, nobody had entered that room without permission. Now it felt different, almost unfamiliar. The first thing I noticed was the filing cabinet. One drawer was completely empty. Harold had always kept partnership agreements, corporate records, and major contracts inside that drawer. Now there was nothing, not even folders. Nothing. My stomach tightened. I checked another cabinet. Several files were missing. Then another. More missing documents. Someone had removed records. Important records. Not random paperwork. Specific paperwork. The kind people remove intentionally. For the first time since Harold's death, genuine fear entered my mind. What exactly was happening? Who had taken those files? And why? 2 days later, I received another answer. By accident. I was having lunch at a small restaurant near downtown Columbus. I had just finished eating when I noticed Victor sitting across the room. He wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit sat opposite him. The two appeared deeply engaged in conversation. I recognized neither the man nor the significance of the meeting, until Victor slid a folder across the table. The suited man opened it, reviewed several pages, then smiled. They shook hands. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, yet something about it felt wrong, very wrong. I remained seated until they left. Then curiosity got the better of me. I approached the waitress. "Do you know who that gentleman was?" She nodded. "He's here pretty often." "Really?" "Yeah. Ethan Brooks." The name meant nothing to me, at least not then. That evening I searched online. The moment I saw the results, my pulse quickened. Ethan Brooks wasn't an investor. He was a business acquisition specialist, someone who purchased companies, someone who bought businesses, someone exactly like the kind of person who would be interested in Powell Industrial Supply. Suddenly the urgency made sense. The secret meetings, the missing documents, the pressure to sell. Someone wasn't exploring options. Someone was already negotiating, and they were doing it behind my back. That night, I barely slept. Questions kept circling through my mind. Had Diane and Kevin known about Ethan Brooks? Was Victor acting alone? How long had these discussions been taking place? And most importantly, what else were they hiding from me? I didn't know it yet, but the answers were already on their way. Because the following morning, my phone would ring, and a woman named Susan Carter would tell me a secret Harold had carried for more than 30 years. A secret that would change everything. The phone rang at exactly 8:17 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because I had barely slept the night before. Thoughts about Victor Ethan Brooks and the missing company records had kept me awake for hours. When the call came through, I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Hello." For a second, there was silence. Then a woman's voice came through the line. "Is this Bernice Powell?" "Yes." "My name is Susan Carter." The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. The woman sounded calm, measured, like someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times. "I know this call is unexpected," she said, "but before you sign anything today, I need to speak with you." Immediately, my heart began racing. "What are you talking about?" Another brief silence. Then she said the words that changed everything. "Harold Powell and I built that company together." I sat upright in my chair. "I'm sorry. I was Harold's business partner." My mind froze. For a moment, I genuinely wondered whether this was some kind of scam, a mistake, a misunderstanding. Because during 42 years of marriage, I had never heard Harold mention a woman named Susan Carter. Not once. "Who are you?" I asked carefully. The woman sighed softly. "That's a fair question." I expected her to launch into a complicated explanation. Instead, she surprised me. "You don't know me, Bernice, but I've known about you for more than 30 years. That statement somehow felt even more unsettling. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying Harold and I founded Powell Industrial Supply together." I gripped the edge of the kitchen table. "No." The answer came automatically, not because I knew she was lying, because I couldn't imagine Harold hiding something that significant. Susan didn't argue. Instead, she said something unexpected. "You have every reason to doubt me." The calmness in her voice made it difficult to dismiss her. Most liars become defensive. Susan sounded almost sympathetic. Finally, she spoke again. "I have documents." That got my attention. "What kind of documents?" "Partnership agreements." My pulse quickened. "Corporate filings." I said nothing. "Tax records." The room suddenly felt very quiet. "And letters written by Harold." My throat tightened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Susan said something else. "I think your family is trying to sell the company." The statement hit me like a punch. "How do you know that?" "Because Victor contacted someone who contacted me." I closed my eyes. Victor again. Everything seemed to lead back to Victor. Susan continued. "When I heard what was happening, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, everything looked normal. Neighbors walking dogs. Cars passing by. Ordinary life. Meanwhile, my world was beginning to shift beneath my feet. "If what you're saying is true," I said carefully, "why didn't Harold ever tell me about you?" That question hung in the air. For the first time, Susan hesitated. When she finally answered, her voice carried sadness. "Because Harold believed he was protecting everyone." I didn't understand. Protecting who? Protecting me. Protecting her. Protecting himself. Nothing made sense. Susan asked if we could meet. Every instinct told me to refuse. After all, she was a stranger, a woman claiming to have shared a major secret with my husband for decades. Yet another instinct told me something equally important. She knew things she shouldn't know, things nobody outside the company could know. Most importantly, she knew about the planned sale. That alone made her impossible to ignore. We agreed to meet that afternoon, a small cafe on the north side of Columbus. Public, safe, neutral. The entire drive there, my thoughts spiraled. What if Harold had been having an affair? What if Susan wasn't a business partner at all? What if everything I believed about my marriage was wrong? By the time I arrived, I felt physically sick. Susan was already there. She sat alone near the back of the cafe, a woman in her late 60s, silver hair, professional clothing. No dramatic appearance, no signs of someone trying to impress or manipulate me. Just a woman waiting quietly. When she saw me, she stood. Her expression surprised me. She looked nervous, not guilty, not arrogant. Nervous. "Bernice." I nodded. Neither of us offered a hug. Neither of us smiled. We simply sat down. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Susan reached into a leather briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. "I think you should see this first." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The first document nearly stopped my heart. A partnership agreement, dated 31 years earlier. I recognized Harold's signature immediately. After decades of marriage, I could identify his handwriting anywhere. The second signature belonged to Susan Carter. I turned another page. Corporate filings, another page. Financial statements, another page. Meeting minutes. Every document appeared authentic. Every document connected Susan to the company. I kept searching for proof of fraud, evidence of forgery, anything. Instead, the documents became stronger, more detailed, more convincing. Finally, I looked up. "Why?" The question escaped before I could stop it. "Why didn't he tell me?" Susan looked down briefly. Then she met my eyes. "Because of Victor." That answer surprised me. I had expected something romantic, something scandalous. Instead, she continued. 30 years ago, Harold and Victor had a major disagreement about the future of the company. I listened carefully. According to Susan, Victor wanted aggressive expansion, large loans, high-risk growth. Harold disagreed. The argument became so severe that Victor left the business completely. Susan had invested money during that period. Enough money to help save the company. Enough money to become a legitimate owner. But Harold feared that if Victor learned the full details, the family conflict would never end. So Susan remained mostly invisible. Not hidden illegally, simply kept out of day-to-day family discussions. The explanation sounded strange, yet strangely believable. More importantly, it matched what I knew about both brothers. Victor had always been ambitious. Harold had always avoided conflict. Then Susan revealed the detail that changed everything. She slid one final document across the table. I looked down. My eyes widened. The percentage listed beside her name made my stomach drop. 49%. I stared at the page, then stared again. Surely I had misread it, but I hadn't. Susan Carter legally owned 49% of Powell Industrial Supply. 49%. Not a symbolic share. Not a minor investment. Almost half the company. I looked at her in disbelief. "You're telling me you've owned nearly half of Harold's company for 3 decades?" Susan shook her head gently. "No, Bernice." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Her answer sent a chill through my body. "It was never only Harold's company." For the first time since Harold died, I realized there were secrets buried much deeper than I had imagined. And somehow I knew we had only begun uncovering them. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? For 42 years, I had believed I understood the foundation of my marriage, my family, and the company Harold and I had spent our lives building. Now, in a single afternoon, I had learned that a woman named Susan Carter legally owned 49% of Powell Industrial Supply, not because of fraud, not because of deception, because she had helped build it from the beginning. The revelation should have made me angry. Oddly enough, it didn't. What troubled me most wasn't Susan. It was the realization that Harold had hidden something so significant from me. I sat awake in bed replaying every conversation we'd ever had about the company, every celebration, every challenge, every expansion. Had there been clues I missed? Had he tried to tell me, or had he truly intended to keep this secret forever? The next morning, Susan called. "There's more you need to see." I agreed to meet her again. This time she invited me to her attorney's office. A part of me felt nervous. Another part felt determined. For weeks, everyone around me had been feeding me carefully selected information. For the first time since Harold's death, I was finally getting answers. When I arrived, Susan was waiting with several large storage boxes. The sight alone surprised me. There weren't a few documents. There were hundreds. Folders, ledgers, contracts, tax filings, corporate records, decades of records. Susan noticed my expression. "I kept everything." I looked at the boxes. "Apparently." For the next several hours, we reviewed documents together. At first, I expected to find inconsistencies, contradictions, something that would expose Susan's story. Instead, every page reinforced it. The earliest documents showed Harold and Susan meeting with suppliers, negotiating financing, signing contracts, building the company during its fragile early years. What shocked me most was learning how much risk Susan had taken. 31 years earlier, when Powell Industrial Supply was struggling, Susan had invested nearly all of her savings. Without that investment, the company might have collapsed. I stared at the figures in disbelief. Harold had never mentioned any of this. Susan seemed to read my thoughts. "He wasn't trying to hurt you." I looked up. "Then why keep it secret?" She sighed. "Because he was stubborn." That answer almost made me laugh. It sounded exactly like Harold. Susan smiled sadly. "He believed he could protect everyone by carrying certain burdens alone." The statement felt painfully familiar. Harold had always done that. Whether it was finances, health concerns, or family conflicts, he often carried problems privately until he believed he had solved them. Unfortunately, some problems never truly disappear. They simply wait. As the afternoon continued, another discovery emerged. One document in particular caught my attention. It was an amended operating agreement, dated 18 months before Harold's death. My pulse quickened. "What's this?" Susan immediately became serious. "This is important." I began reading. The legal language was dense, complicated, but one section stood out immediately. Certain major company decisions required approval from specific parties. One name appeared repeatedly. Mine. Bernice Powell. I read the paragraph again, then a third time. I looked at Susan. "Are you saying they can't sell the company without my approval?" "Correct." A knot in my stomach began to loosen. For the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling relief. But Susan wasn't finished. "There is more." She opened another folder. Inside were copies of handwritten notes. My breath caught. I recognized Harold's handwriting instantly. No spouse could mistake it. The pages weren't formal letters. They looked like personal observations, private thoughts. Some entries discussed suppliers. Others mentioned employees. Then I found Victor's name. My hands froze. Susan remained silent while I read. Harold's note was dated nearly a year before his death. The words were simple, direct, and deeply unsettling. Victor is spending more time around the company again. I don't trust his intentions. I swallowed hard. Another note. Victor keeps asking questions about ownership structure. Another. He seems unusually interested in succession planning. Then another. Need to make sure Bernice is protected if anything happens to me. My eyes filled with tears, not because of the legal implications, because I could hear Harold's voice, even on paper, even after death. I could hear his concern, his caution, his love. Susan handed me a tissue. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Eventually, I found another page. This one mentioned Diane and Kevin. The entry was brief. The children are good people, but grief and money change situations. Must ensure nobody can pressure Bernice. I stared at the sentence. My children. Harold had loved them deeply, yet even he had worried about what might happen under the wrong circumstances. The realization hurt. Not because I believed Diane and Kevin were evil, because I didn't want to believe they were capable of betrayal. Susan quietly folded her hands. Harold wasn't worried about your children. I looked up. What do you mean? He was worried about influence. That made sense. Victor. Again. Every road seemed to lead back to Victor. Susan continued. Your husband believed Victor would eventually try to gain control of the company. I remembered the restaurant meeting with Ethan Brooks. The pressure to sell, the missing files, the constant urgency. For the first time, a larger picture began forming, and it wasn't pretty. Late that afternoon, Susan revealed one final piece of information, a piece that changed everything. She opened a folder labeled Confidential. Inside were board meeting records, voting records, corporate resolutions. As I reviewed them, a pattern emerged. Over the past year, Victor had repeatedly proposed changes to company governance. Changes that would have concentrated more authority into fewer hands. Changes Harold consistently rejected. I looked at the dates. The proposals became more frequent during Harold's final months, almost as if Victor sensed an opportunity approaching. Susan slid another paper toward me. This arrived 2 weeks ago. I examined it carefully. It was a preliminary acquisition proposal. The potential buyer, Ethan Brooks. My stomach dropped. The document was dated before the family meeting, before Diane and Kevin had even mentioned selling the company, which meant one thing. They weren't exploring options. They already had a buyer. They already had a plan. The realization sent a chill through me. For weeks they had pretended to seek my input, pretended to ask for my opinion, pretended to involve me. Meanwhile, discussions were already underway, behind closed doors, without my knowledge, without my permission, without any legal authority. I slowly set the document down. What happens now? Susan's answer was immediate. We let them continue. I frowned. What? We don't warn them. The attorney sitting beside her finally spoke. Rebecca Hayes had remained mostly silent throughout the meeting. Now she leaned forward. If they're attempting to act without authority, We need evidence. I understood immediately. They wanted the truth exposed. Not suspected, proven. Susan nodded. The sale meeting is scheduled for Friday. 3 days away. 3 days until the trap closed. 3 days until Victor, Diane, and Kevin believed they would finally take control. I looked down at Harold's handwritten notes, then back at Susan. For the first time since his death, I felt something stronger than grief. Resolve. Someone had spent months treating me like I was weak, like I was incapable, like I could be manipulated. They were about to discover how wrong they were. And on Friday morning, I intended to let them reveal exactly who they had become. Friday arrived with gray skies and steady rain. It felt appropriate. For weeks, a storm had been building around me. Now it was finally time to watch it break. I woke before dawn. For several minutes, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Normally, Harold would have been sitting across from me, reading reports, reviewing schedules, talking about customers. The silence still hurt. But this morning, something had changed. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel helpless. I felt prepared. The meeting to sell Powell Industrial Supply was scheduled for 10 o'clock. According to Victor, it was merely an opportunity to explore options. According to the documents Susan had shown me, it was much more than that. This wasn't a discussion. It was a transaction. A transaction they had already decided to complete. Without me. Without legal authority. And without realizing the truth was about to walk through the door. Before leaving home, I received a brief call from Susan. "Everything is ready." I took a deep breath. "Good. Are you certain you want to do this?" I looked toward the framed photograph of Harold sitting on the bookshelf. His familiar smile stared back at me. "No," I admitted honestly. "But I'm going." After hanging up, I drove to company headquarters. Rain tapped against the windshield the entire way. The weather reminded me of funeral day. The same heavy clouds. The same sense of something ending. Only this time what was ending wasn't a life. It was a lie. When I entered the building, several employees greeted me warmly. Michael Turner approached almost immediately. His expression suggested he knew something important was happening. "Mrs. Powell." I smiled. "Good morning, Michael." His eyes searched mine, almost as if he wanted reassurance. I gave him a small nod. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He understood. Not the details, but enough. The sale meeting was being held in the large conference room Harold had always used for major decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very room where he had protected the company for decades was about to become the place where the truth emerged. When I entered, everyone was already there. Victor, Diane, Kevin, and Ethan Brooks, the buyer, the man I had seen meeting secretly with Victor at the restaurant. Victor immediately stood. "Bernice!" His smile looked rehearsed, artificial. "We're glad you made it." I almost laughed, as if my attendance were optional, as if this weren't my husband's company, as if I weren't one of the people they were trying to push aside. I took a seat without responding. Across the table, Ethan Brooks extended his hand. He was polished, confident, the kind of businessman who knew exactly how much money every room contained. "Mrs. Powell, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." I shook his hand politely. "Likewise." If Ethan suspected anything unusual, he didn't show it. In fact, he appeared remarkably comfortable. Too comfortable, as though he believed today's outcome was already guaranteed. The meeting began. Victor quickly took control. Not surprisingly, Over the previous months, he had gradually positioned himself as the unofficial leader of every discussion. Today was no different. He launched into a presentation about changing markets, economic pressures, industry consolidation, the need to act quickly. I listened quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally taking notes, most importantly saying almost nothing. Across the table, Diane seemed unusually relaxed. Kevin looked eager. Neither appeared nervous. Neither acted like someone making a difficult decision. Instead, they behaved like people expecting a reward. That realization hurt more than I expected, because despite everything, they were still my children. I had raised them, loved them, sacrificed for them. Yet sitting there, I felt less like their mother and more like an obstacle. After nearly 30 minutes of presentations, Ethan began discussing valuation. That was when something became impossible to ignore. The numbers. Even without access to current financial records, I knew enough about the company to recognize a problem. The proposed sale price was absurdly low, dangerously low. I kept my expression neutral, but internally alarms were ringing. Powell Industrial Supply owned valuable real estate. Long-term contracts, equipment, inventory, customer relationships. The offer on the table failed to reflect any of it. Eventually I spoke. My first question of the morning: how was this valuation determined? The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan answered smoothly. Our analysts reviewed available financial information. Available information. Interesting choice of words. I glanced toward Kevin. His eyes immediately shifted downward. That told me more than any answer could. Victor quickly jumped in. It's a fair offer. I looked directly at him. Based on what? For a fraction of a second, his confidence faltered. Then he recovered. The current market. I said nothing, because the truth was becoming clearer. The goal wasn't maximizing value. The goal was completing the sale. Fast. Before questions could be asked. Before facts could be examined. Before someone like Susan Carter appeared. The meeting continued. Documents were distributed. Charts were reviewed. Future projections were discussed. All carefully designed to support one conclusion: sell now. Every road led to the same destination. Finally, Victor slid a stack of papers toward me. There are a few preliminary documents we'd like you to review. There it was. The moment. I looked down at the paperwork, then slowly turned pages, maintaining the appearance of careful consideration. Inside, however, I was noticing something much more important. The signatures. Or rather, the missing signatures. Because despite all the confidence in the room, nobody had yet explained how they intended to overcome the legal obstacles Susan had shown me. The ownership structure, the voting requirements, the approval process. None of it had been mentioned, almost as though they hoped I would never ask. Eventually, I looked up. I have a question. Victor smiled. Of course. Do all necessary owners approve this transaction? For the first time that morning, genuine tension appeared. Small, subtle, but unmistakable. Diane shifted in her chair. Kevin adjusted his tie. Victor's smile tightened. Then he answered, yes. The lie came effortlessly. Too effortlessly. I watched him carefully. All owners. Yes. I nodded slowly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because now I had heard it directly. Not suspicion. Not assumptions. A direct false statement. Exactly what Rebecca Hayes had hoped for. Ethan appeared confused. Perhaps he didn't fully understand the ownership structure. Or perhaps Victor had misled him as well. At that moment, my sympathy for Ethan briefly increased. If he was innocent, he was about to experience a very unpleasant surprise. If he wasn't innocent, then he deserved what was coming. The discussion moved forward. The pressure increased. Victor wanted signatures. Kevin wanted signatures. Even Diane began encouraging me. "Mom, this is the right thing." The words hurt, because she sounded sincere, as if she genuinely believed it, as if months of manipulation had convinced her that selling Harold's legacy was somehow an act of love. I looked around the room, at the people who believed they controlled the situation, at the people who believed I knew nothing, at the people who thought they were minutes away from victory. Then I checked the clock. 10:43 a.m. Right on schedule. Any second now, the conference room door would open, and everything they thought they knew would begin falling apart. At exactly 10:44 a.m., the conference room door opened. The timing was so perfect it almost felt rehearsed. Every head turned toward the entrance. Victor stopped speaking mid-sentence. Kevin lowered his pen. Diane looked confused. Ethan Brooks glanced toward the doorway with mild irritation, clearly assuming someone had interrupted an important business meeting. Then Susan Carter walked into the room. Behind her was a woman carrying a leather briefcase. Attorney Rebecca Hayes. The silence was immediate. Absolute. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Victor was the first to recover. His face drained of color. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. "Susan." He said her name the way people speak when they unexpectedly see a ghost. Susan remained calm, professional, controlled. "Hello, Victor." The tension in the room became almost physical. Ethan frowned, looking from one face to another, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Victor stood. "This is a private meeting." Rebecca Hayes smiled politely. "Actually, that depends on who owns the company." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Susan slowly walked to the conference table and placed several folders in front of her. The gesture was simple, but the effect was enormous. For the first time all morning, Victor looked genuinely nervous. I had spent weeks watching him control every conversation, every meeting, every decision. Now I was watching that confidence crack. Rebecca opened her briefcase. "Before this transaction proceeds," she said calmly, "certain legal matters must be addressed." Ethan immediately straightened in his chair. "What legal matters?" Rebecca slid a document across the table. "Ownership." The room became even quieter, if that was possible. Victor attempted a laugh, a forced one. "We already reviewed ownership." "No," Rebecca replied. "You reviewed what was convenient." I almost admired her composure. There was no anger in her voice, no drama, only facts. And facts are often more dangerous than emotions. Ethan picked up the document. His eyes moved across the page. Then he frowned. "What is this?" Susan answered. "The original partnership agreement." The buyer's expression changed immediately. He turned another page, then another, then another. His posture stiffened. I watched realization begin forming, slowly, painfully, like someone discovering they had been walking across thin ice. Victor suddenly interrupted. "These documents are irrelevant." Susan looked directly at him. "No, Victor." Then she pointed to the ownership percentages. The room seemed to freeze. These documents establish that I legally own 49% of Powell Industrial Supply. Ethan stared at the page, then at Susan, then back at the page. The color disappeared from his face. What? Susan didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The paperwork spoke clearly. Rebecca continued. Furthermore, amendments made 18 months ago require additional approvals before any sale can occur. Now Ethan looked toward Victor. What amendments? That question landed like a hammer, because Victor suddenly had no good answer. For several seconds, he simply sat there, silent. Then he finally spoke. We were handling those issues. Handling. Interesting word. Not resolved. Not approved. Handling. Ethan's expression darkened. You told me ownership was consolidated. Nobody answered. You told me authority was clear. Still nobody answered. The buyer's frustration grew. I couldn't blame him. Whatever his motives, he clearly wasn't expecting this disaster. Then Rebecca placed another document on the table. This one changed everything. There's another matter. I already knew what was coming. Susan had warned me. But seeing it unfold in real time was still shocking. Rebecca turned toward me. Mrs. Powell, would you recognize your own signature? The question startled everyone, including Diane and Kevin. I nodded slowly. Yes. Rebecca handed me a document. I examined it carefully. At first glance, the signature looked like mine. The same style, the same flourish, the same shape. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. After 40 years of signing legal documents, you learn to recognize your own handwriting. This wasn't it. I looked up. I didn't sign this. The room exploded. What? Kevin's voice cracked. Rebecca remained calm. This document contains authorization allegedly provided by Bernice Powell. Allegedly. A devastating word. She turned toward Kevin. Would you care to explain how this document was created? The silence that followed was unforgettable. Kevin didn't answer. He couldn't, because his face had already answered for him. Panic. Pure panic. Diane looked at him, then looked again, as if seeing him for the first time. Kevin. Her voice sounded small, frightened. Kevin swallowed hard. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Ethan slammed the document onto the table. You forged her signature. Kevin immediately shook his head. It wasn't like that. The wrong answer. The worst possible answer. Because innocent people say no. Guilty people explain. Rebecca folded her hands. Then perhaps you can clarify. Kevin looked desperately toward Victor, looking for help, looking for rescue. None came. Victor suddenly seemed fascinated by the conference table. The man who had dominated every conversation for months couldn't even make eye contact. Kevin's voice trembled. It was only preliminary paperwork. I closed my eyes. There it was. The admission. Not a complete confession, but enough. Far more than enough. Diane stared at her brother in disbelief. You told me Mom signed everything. Kevin said nothing. Her face turned pale. You told me it was already approved. Still nothing. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in her eyes, because she was beginning to understand the truth. Not only had the sale been unauthorized, the entire process had been built on deception. Ethan slowly stood. His expression had transformed completely. The confident businessman was gone. Now he looked furious. Victor. The older man finally looked up. "You assured me all ownership issues had been resolved." Victor attempted one final defense. "There may have been some misunderstandings." Ethan laughed. A short, angry laugh. "Misunderstandings." He held up the partnership agreement. "You forgot to mention a 49% owner." Then he held up the authorization form. "You forgot to mention a forged signature." The room fell silent again. Victor had run out of places to hide, run out of explanations, run out of control. For months he had manipulated information, directed conversations, applied pressure. Now everything was collapsing in front of him, and he couldn't stop it. I watched him carefully, waiting. Eventually, he looked at me. For the first time since Harold's death, he appeared uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Bernice." I raised a hand, stopping him immediately. "No." The word came out stronger than I expected. Victor stopped talking. I continued. "For months you treated me like I didn't matter." Nobody spoke. "You acted as though Harold's company belonged to you." Silence. "You tried to convince me I was incapable of making decisions." Kevin lowered his eyes. Diane began crying quietly. But I wasn't finished. "Most of all, you assumed I would never learn the truth." The room remained frozen. Rebecca finally closed her briefcase. Susan sat quietly beside her. Neither woman needed to say anything else. The evidence had already spoken. The lies had already surfaced. The sale was dead. But deep inside, I knew something even worse was about to emerge. Because forged signatures and hidden ownership weren't the whole story. Not even close. And before this was over, I would discover just how far my own family had been willing to go. The conference room emptied slowly. Not because people wanted to stay, because nobody knew how to leave. The meeting that had begun as a celebration of a business sale had ended in humiliation, accusations, and silence. Ethan Brooks was the first to go. Before leaving, he gathered every document his team had brought and shoved them into a briefcase. His face was red with anger. At the door, he turned toward Victor. "If your representations were false, my attorneys will be contacting you." Victor didn't respond. He couldn't. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had no words. After Ethan left, several managers quietly slipped out of the room. Only a handful of us remained. Me, Diane, Kevin, Victor, Susan, Rebecca, and Michael Turner. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy, almost unbearable. Then Kevin finally stood. "Mom." I held up my hand. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion. I couldn't listen to excuses. Not yet. Not after everything I had learned. Kevin lowered his head. For a moment, he looked like a frightened little boy instead of a grown man approaching 40. But appearances no longer meant much to me, because people I loved had spent months lying directly to my face. Eventually, everyone left except Susan and me. The moment the conference room door closed behind the others, I felt the strength drain from my body. I sat heavily in my chair, suddenly exhausted. Susan remained quiet, giving me space, giving me time. Finally, I spoke. "How bad is it?" She looked at me carefully. "Worse than the forgery." A chill moved through me. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I nodded. "Tell me." Susan exchanged a glance with Rebecca. The attorney opened another folder. My stomach tightened immediately. I was beginning to hate folders. Every folder seemed to contain another betrayal, another secret, Another wound. Rebecca slid several pages toward me. After we learned about the proposed sale, we started investigating. I began reading. The first document showed email exchanges. The second contained financial projections. The third revealed proposed asset distributions. At first, none of it made sense. Then I reached a section highlighted in yellow, and everything changed. My hands began trembling. Wait! I read the paragraph again, then again. Surely I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The words remained exactly the same. After liquidation of company assets, arrangements will be made for Mrs. Bernice Powell's transition into long-term residential care. I stared at the page, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to process what I was seeing. Residential care, a nursing home, an assisted living facility, not a suggestion, not a possibility, a plan, an actual plan. The room suddenly felt cold. What is this? My voice barely sounded like my own. Susan answered softly. A proposal attached to the acquisition documents. I looked up. No? My throat tightened. No. Rebecca gently pointed to another page. The signatures weren't final. The proposal hadn't been executed, but it existed, which meant people had discussed it, planned it, considered it. I kept reading. Each paragraph felt worse than the one before. According to the proposal, after the company was sold, I would be relocated to a private assisted living facility outside Columbus. The justification was written in polished legal language. Concern for my well-being. Need for professional support. Simplified living arrangements. The words sounded compassionate, but the meaning was obvious. Remove Bernice. Control the money. Eliminate the obstacle. My eyes filled with tears. Not because of the facility itself. There is nothing wrong with assisted living when someone truly needs it. What hurt was the deception. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had discussed it. My own children had planned my future as if I were incapable of deciding it myself, as if I were furniture that needed relocating. Susan reached across the table and gently touched my hand. I'm sorry. I shook my head, still staring at the documents. Did Diane know? The question felt dangerous, because deep down I already suspected the answer. Rebecca hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Yes. One word. One simple word. Yet it hurt more than any legal document. I closed my eyes. Memories flooded my mind. Diane learning to ride a bicycle. Diane graduating high school. Diane crying on her wedding day. All those years, all those memories. And somehow we had arrived here, to a point where my daughter had helped plan a future without consulting me, a future designed around convenience, not love, not respect, convenience. I took several deep breaths, then asked the question I feared most. Was it Victor's idea? Susan answered immediately. Yes. That wasn't surprising. What surprised me was what came next. But Diane agreed. The room fell silent again. I nodded slowly, accepting a truth I desperately wished weren't real. Several minutes passed before either of us spoke. Eventually, Susan opened another folder. This one was thinner. Older, more worn. There is one more thing. I almost laughed. At that point, I wasn't sure my heart could survive one more thing, but Susan carefully removed a sealed envelope. The sight instantly captured my attention, because I recognized the handwriting. Harold's. My breath caught. Even after all these years, I would have recognized his writing anywhere. The envelope was yellowed with age, folded carefully, protected, treasured. Susan held it gently. He gave this to me 11 months ago. I stared at it, unable to look away. He told me to deliver it only if certain things happened. My chest tightened. What things? Susan's expression softened. If he died. I swallowed. And if people tried to take advantage of you afterward. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire room seemed suspended in time. Harold, even gone, even buried, still trying to protect me. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I didn't wipe them away. Susan placed the envelope in front of me. Neither she nor Rebecca touched it again. The decision was mine. Slowly, I picked it up. The paper felt fragile, as if decades of memories were folded inside. My fingers traced Harold's handwriting, one line written across the front. For Bernice. Only if I'm no longer there to tell her myself. The tears came harder then, because suddenly he felt close again. Not gone, not distant. Close. As though his voice were waiting on the other side of the paper. I looked toward Susan. Have you read it? She shook her head. No. Rebecca shook her head as well. The seal remained intact, untouched, waiting. For me. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part was terrified, because whatever Harold had written, he had considered important enough to preserve for nearly a year, important enough to entrust to Susan, important enough to keep secret. Eventually, I slipped the envelope into my purse. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed time. I needed space. Most of all, I needed courage. As Susan and I left the conference room, I looked back one final time. The sale had collapsed. Victor's scheme had been exposed. Kevin's forgery had surfaced. Diane's betrayal had been revealed. Yet somehow I felt the hardest part still lay ahead. Because tomorrow I would open Harold's final letter. And deep inside, I already knew it contained truths that would change the rest of my life. I waited until the next morning to open Harold's letter. Not because I lacked opportunity, because I lacked courage. That envelope sat on my kitchen table all night. Every time I walked past it, I felt a mixture of longing and fear. Longing because it contained his words. Fear because it contained his final truth. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I made coffee, sat at the same table where Harold and I had shared thousands of breakfasts, and carefully placed the envelope in front of me. The house was completely silent. No television, no music, no distractions. Just me. And the last message my husband would ever send. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. For a moment, I simply stared at the folded pages inside. Then I began reading. My dearest Bernice, if you're reading this, then two things have happened. First, I'm gone. Second, some of the people we love have disappointed you. The tears started immediately. That was Harold. Direct. Honest. Always able to say exactly what mattered. I continued reading. I hope I'm wrong. I truly do. I hope this letter never becomes necessary. But if Susan has placed it in your hands, then my fears were justified. Please remember something before you read another word. Nothing that happens after my death is your fault. You have spent your life loving people generously. If someone chooses to misuse that love, the responsibility belongs to them, not to you. I stopped reading, pressed the paper against my chest, and cried, because even in death, Harold was comforting me, protecting me, thinking about my feelings before his own legacy. Eventually, I continued. For several years, I have been concerned about Victor, not because he is evil, because he values control more than relationships. People like that often convince themselves their actions are justified. I have watched him become increasingly interested in the company, increasingly interested in ownership, increasingly interested in what happens after I'm gone. I wanted to tell you everything directly, but I kept hoping I was wrong. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't suspicion. This was Harold documenting concerns he had carried for years, concerns that had now become reality. The letter continued. As for Diane and Kevin, I need you to hear me clearly. They are not bad people, but good people can make terrible decisions when they allow the wrong voices into their lives. Do not hate them. Do not excuse them either. There is a difference. That sentence hit me harder than anything else, because it captured exactly what I had been struggling with. Part of me wanted to defend my children. Another part wanted to cut them out of my life forever. Harold understood both reactions, and somehow he found a wiser path between them. I kept reading. Bernice, you have spent most of your life putting others first. You sacrificed for me. You sacrificed for our children. You sacrificed for our company. Now I need you to do something difficult. Choose yourself. For once, choose yourself. The room became very still. Choose yourself. I don't think anyone had ever told me that before. Certainly not Harold. Not because he didn't care. Because we belonged to a generation that believed sacrifice was love. Service was love. Endurance was love. Yet here he was asking me to do something different, something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable. Value myself. Protect myself. Refuse to disappear. I wiped my eyes and continued, if anyone pressures you to surrender your voice, don't. If anyone asks you to give away your dignity, don't. If anyone claims that keeping peace requires accepting mistreatment, don't. You deserve better. You always have. My heart broke all over again, because I suddenly realized how much Harold had seen, how much he understood, perhaps more than I ever knew. Then I reached the final section of the letter, the section Susan had hinted about, and the section that changed everything. There is one last matter. The operating agreement Susan showed you was only part of my plan. If circumstances require it, control of my voting interest transfers entirely to you. Not to Victor, not to the children, to you. I stared at the page, then read it again, then a third time. Control, not symbolic authority, real authority, legal authority, the kind that determines the future of a company, the kind that decides what survives and what doesn't. Harold had given it to me, not because he believed I was perfect, because he believed I could be trusted. The realization nearly overwhelmed me. For months, everyone had treated me as weak, fragile, confused. Meanwhile, the person who knew me best had quietly entrusted me with everything. The final paragraphs were shorter, simpler, and somehow more painful. If you're holding this letter, then I wish I had one more day with you. Just one. I would sit beside you on the porch, hold your hand, and remind you that you are stronger than you think. You've always been stronger than you think. I love you, Bernice. Always. Harold. I couldn't continue after that. The letter slipped from my hands, and I cried harder than I had cried since his funeral. Not because I was weak, because grief and love sometimes occupy the same space. Eventually, hours later, I found myself sitting quietly in the backyard. The letter rested beside me. The same porch, the same view, the same place where Harold and I had spent countless evenings together. For the first time since his death, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not complete peace, not permanent peace, but enough. Enough to think clearly, enough to make decisions, enough to stop allowing other people to define my future. That afternoon, Diane called. I stared at the phone for several seconds before answering. "Mom." Her voice sounded exhausted. She had probably spent the entire weekend dealing with the fallout from the failed sale. I said nothing. Finally, she spoke again. "I'm sorry." The words surprised me. Not because they fixed anything, because they were the first honest words I'd heard from her in months. Tears filled her voice. "I never wanted to hurt you." I closed my eyes. Part of me believed her. Part of me didn't know what to believe anymore. "Diane." My voice remained calm. "Did you know about the nursing home plan?" The silence lasted too long. Much too long. When she finally answered, her voice broke. "Yes." The truth hurt, even though I already knew it. Sometimes confirmation hurts more than discovery. I thought it would help. I looked toward Harold's letter. Help. Such a dangerous word. So many terrible decisions are justified in the name of helping. "You should have asked me." "I know." More tears. More silence. Eventually, she whispered something unexpected. "Mom, I think Uncle Victor manipulated all of us." Maybe, but not completely, because manipulation explains influence. It doesn't erase responsibility, and for the first time in my life, I understood something important. Loving someone doesn't require protecting them from consequences. That realization changed everything. By the time the call ended, I had made my decision. No more hiding, no more hesitation, no more surrendering responsibility to other people. Harold had trusted me with his legacy, trusted me with the company, trusted me with myself. Now it was time to prove he had been right, and the first step would be making sure everyone involved faced the consequences of their choices. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult and most empowering of my life. For months after Harold's death, I had felt as though events were happening to me. Now, for the first time, I was taking action. The Monday after reading Harold's letter, I met with Susan Carter and attorney Rebecca Hayes. We gathered in Rebecca's office overlooking downtown Columbus. The mood was serious, not emotional, not dramatic, practical. The truth had already been uncovered. Now came the consequences. Rebecca spread several files across the conference table. "Let's start with the forgery." Even hearing the word still hurt. Forgery. Such a cold, ugly word, especially when connected to my own son. Rebecca explained that Kevin's unauthorized use of my signature created significant legal exposure. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was accountability. There is a difference. I thought about Harold's letter. Do not hate them. Do not excuse them either. That became my guiding principle. When Rebecca asked how aggressively I wanted to proceed, I took several moments before answering. "I don't want to destroy my son." She nodded. "But I also won't pretend it didn't happen." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I think that's a wise position." The investigation moved forward. Over the following days, additional information emerged. Some of it surprised me. Some of it didn't. Kevin eventually admitted he had signed documents on my behalf. His explanation was painful to hear. He claimed he believed the sale would eventually happen anyway. He claimed Victor had convinced him the paperwork was merely procedural. He claimed he never expected legal consequences. Whether those explanations were true or not, one fact remained unchanged. He had crossed a line. And lines matter, especially when trust is involved. Meanwhile, Rebecca's team continued reviewing financial records. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. Victor's involvement extended far beyond simple advice. He hadn't merely supported the sale, he had actively encouraged it. In some cases, he had been the driving force behind it. Emails showed him pressuring Diane and Kevin. Meeting notes revealed repeated attempts to gain influence over company decisions. Several communications suggested he expected significant financial benefits if the acquisition succeeded. Nothing illegal by itself, but highly revealing. The pattern was obvious. Victor wasn't protecting the company. He was positioning himself to profit from its sale. When confronted with the evidence, he denied everything. At first, then partially admitted it, then blamed misunderstandings, then blamed grief, then blamed everyone except himself. Watching the process unfold was strangely sad, because I remembered the man Victor used to be, the uncle who attended birthdays, the brother who stood beside Harold during difficult times. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced loyalty, and now the cost was becoming clear. The company itself also underwent a detailed review. This part brought unexpected relief. For months, Diane and Kevin had insisted the business was struggling. The numbers told a very different story. Powell Industrial Supply was healthy, not perfect, not immune to future challenges, but healthy, profitable, stable. In some areas, stronger than it had been in years. When Michael Turner presented updated reports, I couldn't help smiling. Harold had been right. Again. The business he loved wasn't dying. It had been misrepresented. Deliberately. That realization strengthened my resolve. I wasn't merely protecting an asset. I was protecting decades of work, years of sacrifice, the livelihoods of employees who had trusted our family. Several weeks later, I held my first official leadership meeting. My first. The thought would have terrified me 6 months earlier. Now, it felt natural. Susan sat beside me. Michael sat across from us. Department managers filled the room. For the first time since Harold's death, the atmosphere felt hopeful. Not because problems had disappeared, because honesty had returned. I addressed the group directly. I know the last few months have been difficult. Heads nodded around the room. I know many of you were uncertain about the future. More nods. I took a breath. Powell Industrial Supply is not being sold. The response was immediate. Relief. Visible relief. Some employees actually smiled. Others exchanged glances. One manager quietly applauded. Soon others joined. The sound caught me completely off guard. I felt tears threatening again. Not sadness this time. Gratitude. Because these people weren't celebrating money. They were celebrating stability, community, the preservation of something they had helped build. After the meeting, Michael remained behind. As the room emptied, he approached me. Harold would be proud. The words hit me harder than he probably intended. I looked down briefly, then smiled. I hope so. Michael shook his head. No. His voice was firm. I know so. That conversation stayed with me for days. Perhaps because I needed to hear it. Perhaps because grief sometimes makes us question ourselves. Either way, his words mattered. Meanwhile, another relationship was slowly evolving. My friendship with Susan. The woman who had entered my life as a shocking secret was becoming something entirely different. A trusted ally. A genuine friend. The more time we spent together, the more I understood why Harold respected her. She was practical, honest, loyal. Most importantly, she cared deeply about the company. One afternoon, while reviewing future plans, I finally asked a question that had been bothering me. "Susan, why didn't you just buy everyone out years ago?" She laughed softly. "Because I never wanted control." I frowned. "Then what did you want?" Her answer was immediate. "To protect what we built." Simple. Sincere. True. Not once during the entire ordeal had Susan asked for more money. Not once had she attempted to exploit the situation. Not once had she used her ownership position for personal gain. She had stepped forward for one reason: to honor a promise she made to Harold. That realization deepened my respect for her. By contrast, Victor's position continued weakening. Business relationships deteriorated. His credibility suffered. Several opportunities he had been pursuing disappeared. Eventually, he stopped contacting me entirely. I wasn't surprised. There wasn't much left to say. The hardest situation involved Diane and Kevin. Unlike Victor, they remained part of my life. At least potentially. The damage was real. The trust was broken. Yet they were still my children. That truth complicated everything. Both eventually apologized. More than once. The apologies seemed sincere, especially after they learned the full extent of Victor's manipulation. But apologies don't erase consequences. And they don't instantly rebuild trust. That process would take time. A great deal of time. One evening, several months after the failed sale, I sat alone on the back porch reading Harold's letter again. The paper had become slightly worn from repeated handling. Certain passages were practically memorized, especially one. Choose yourself. For once, choose yourself. I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I finally understood what he meant. Choosing myself wasn't selfish. Protecting my dignity wasn't selfish. Setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary. And thanks to Harold, Susan, and a painful series of truths, I was finally learning how to do it. What I didn't know then was that the most healing chapter of this story was still waiting ahead. 6 months later, I stood in front of a brand new sign. The morning sun reflected off freshly painted letters. For several moments, I simply stared at them. Not because they were beautiful, because of what they represented. After everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the legal battles, the grief, the company was still standing, and so was I. The sign read, Powell and Carter Industrial Supply. The decision to rename the company had surprised many people. At first, some employees worried it meant abandoning Harold's legacy. The opposite was true. For decades, Susan's contribution had remained hidden, not because she wanted recognition, because Harold believed secrecy would keep the peace. We had both learned the same lesson. Sometimes truth deserves sunlight, sometimes hidden sacrifices deserve acknowledgement. And so the company entered a new chapter carrying both names, Powell and Carter, the two people who had built it, the two people whose partnership had saved it. The morning of the unveiling, dozens of employees gathered outside headquarters. Some had worked with Harold for 20 years, others for 30. A few had been there almost from the beginning. As I looked around, I realized something important. Businesses aren't really buildings. They're people, families, relationships, trust. That was the real legacy Harold left behind. Not money, not equipment, not property. People. When the small ceremony ended, Michael Turner approached me carrying a framed photograph. I recognized it instantly. It had been taken nearly 3 decades earlier. Harold stood beside Susan in front of the company's first warehouse. Both looked impossibly young. Both looked exhausted. And both looked proud. Michael handed me the frame. We found it in storage. My eyes filled with tears. For a long moment I couldn't speak. Finally I smiled. Thank you. The photograph eventually found a permanent place in the company lobby. Not hidden, not forgotten, exactly where it belonged. As for Susan, our friendship continued growing. Sometimes life introduces people unexpectedly. Not to complicate your story, to complete it. We spent long afternoons reviewing company plans, talking about Harold, sharing memories, laughing at stories neither of us had heard before. For years, each of us had known different versions of the same man. Now those memories were coming together. One afternoon, Susan smiled and said something I'll never forget. You know, Harold used to brag about you constantly. I laughed. He did not. He absolutely did. Her smile widened. If a meeting lasted more than 20 minutes, your name came up. The image made me laugh through tears. It sounded exactly like him. The realization brought comfort. Because grief changes over time. At first, it feels like drowning. Later, it feels like carrying a heavy stone. Eventually, it becomes something different. A quiet companion. A reminder of love. That was where I finally found myself. Not free from grief. Living alongside it. Meanwhile, the situation with Diane and Kevin remained complicated. Healing is rarely dramatic. It's usually slow, awkward, uneven. Trust doesn't return because someone apologizes. Trust returns because behavior changes. Over time, I began seeing those changes. Not immediately, not perfectly, but genuinely. Kevin accepted responsibility for what he had done. No excuses, no blame shifting, no elaborate explanations, just accountability. That mattered. Diane struggled more, perhaps because she carried guilt from multiple directions. Guilt for participating, guilt for remaining silent, guilt for not questioning Victor sooner. One evening, she visited my house alone. No agenda, no paperwork, no requests. Just a daughter sitting across from her mother. We talked for hours about Harold, about family, about mistakes. Eventually, she began crying. I thought I was helping. I believed her, not because helping justified what happened, because intentions and consequences aren't always the same thing. I reached across the table and took her hand. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I said something I had spent months considering. I forgive you. She broke down completely. The words mattered. But forgiveness wasn't the most important part. The next sentence was, I forgive you, but things will be different. She nodded immediately. I understand. And she did. Because forgiveness and trust are not identical. One can exist before the other. The boundaries remained. The company remained under my control. Major decisions remained protected. The safeguards Harold created remained in place. Not because I wanted revenge, because wisdom sometimes looks like caution. As for Victor, our relationship never recovered. Some fractures don't heal. Some choices permanently change how people see one another. I didn't hate him. Hatred requires too much energy. I simply accepted reality. He had chosen ambition over family, control over loyalty, and eventually those choices left him isolated. Life has a way of collecting debts, not always through courts, sometimes through consequences. 1 year after Harold's death, I returned to our back porch, the same porch where we had spent countless evenings together, the same porch where he had once warned me to ask questions, the same porch where I had read his final letter. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. Birds sang somewhere in the distance. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt quiet, not empty, peaceful. I carried Harold's letter with me. The paper had become worn from frequent reading. Certain sections were nearly memorized, especially the final lines. "You've always been stronger than you think." I smiled, because he had been right. Not about everything, no husband ever is, but about that. Yes, he had been right. I was stronger than I thought, stronger than grief, stronger than betrayal, stronger than fear. Most importantly, stronger than the version of myself that believed keeping peace required staying silent. As the sun began setting, I looked toward the horizon and imagined Harold sitting beside me. Not as a ghost, not as a fantasy, as a memory, a beautiful one, the kind worth carrying forever. "I did it," I whispered. The breeze moved gently across the porch, and for a moment I almost felt him smile. The company survived. The truth survived. And somehow, after everything, so did I. If this experience taught me anything, it's that love should never require you to surrender your dignity. For much of my life, I believed being a good wife, mother, and family member meant sacrificing my own needs. I believed keeping peace was more important than asking difficult questions. I believed trusting people meant never doubting them. I was wrong. Real love welcomes honesty. Real family respects boundaries. And real loyalty never asks you to give away your voice. The hardest lesson I learned was that the people we love can make painful mistakes. Sometimes they disappoint us. Sometimes they betray our trust. But protecting yourself does not make you cruel. Setting boundaries does not make you selfish. And refusing to be manipulated does not mean you love less. Harold's greatest gift wasn't the company he left behind. It wasn't money. It wasn't ownership. It was the reminder that my value never depended on someone else's approval. No matter your age, it is never too late to stand up for yourself. It is never too late to reclaim your confidence. And it is never too late to choose yourself. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven Diane and Kevin? Or would you have walked away completely? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, please share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Stories like this bring people together from everywhere, and I always enjoy reading your messages. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more heartfelt stories about family resilience, justice, and second chances.